Caliban and the Witch is the kind of history book that will be annotated, highlighted, and dog-eared to the point of being unreadable by the time you turn the final page. My copy certainly is, at least. Now, I just called this a history book, and while it certainly is that, it also very smartly and intricately blends in sociology and political philosophy as well. Trying to sum it up is genuinely difficult, and what I want to do here in this video is just outline some of the incredible things, like I'm talking mind-blowing, life-changing things that I learned reading this book. But if I were to try and sum up Caliban and the Witch, it's a book that explores the rise of capitalism in Western Europe and the subjugation of the bodies of women and minority people to better serve patriarchal hierarchies in Europe. It is very much a feminist text, but it is also, as I said, a piece of political philosophy inspired by the works and the writings of Karl Marx that looks at the rise and expansion of the class system, and, as I said, the subjugation of minority ethnic bodies as well. There's a lot going on here, and it repeatedly blew my mind. It begins by exploring the established status quo of feudal Western Europe, as serfs were toiling in service to their lords. And in its opening chapter, it explores all of the rebellions that happened at this time, the ways in which the serving class built rebellions and fought in wars against their lords. For example, and we'll touch on this more later, the heretics. And then the book moves into the rise of capitalism, the ways in which the social, political, philosophical, and mechanical systems of Europe shifted from the feudal system to a modern capitalist system, and what that meant for women and minority ethnic people, as well as, very simply and broadly, poor people. In one single sentence, Caliban and the Witch is about the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy. And I'm going to show you 15 moments in this book where my mind was blown and my life was changed. Now, as I was reading and annotating and highlighting Caliban and the Witch, I was also making notes in my phone. Those notes were titled Things I Learned from Caliban and the Witch, and they're kind of ridiculous, so I'm going to read them out for my own amusement. The very first note I made was, all in caps, heresy, page 31. Now, as I briefly alluded to, there were people called the heretics. Today, you say the word heretic and certain things come to mind, all negative. And that is historical propaganda against working class people trying to break free of their fetters. Here's a mind-blowing thing that the book taught me about the heretic movement during the feudal system in Western Europe. Although influenced by Eastern religions brought to Europe by merchants and crusaders, popular heresy was less a deviation from the orthodox doctrine than a protest movement aspiring to a radical democratization of social life. Heresy was the equivalent of liberation theology for the medieval proletariat. It gave a frame to people's demands for spiritual renewal and social justice, challenging both the church and secular authority by appeal to a higher truth. It denounced social hierarchies, private property, and the accumulation of wealth. And it disseminated among the people a new revolutionary concept of society that, for the first time in the Middle Ages, redefined every aspect of daily life: work, property, sexual reproduction, and the position of women, posing the question of emancipation in truly universal terms. The Heretic Movement also provided an alternative community structure that had an international dimension, enabling the members of the sects to lead a more autonomous life and to benefit from a wide support network made of contacts, schools, and safe houses, upon which they could rely for help and inspiration in times of need. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that the Heretic Movement was the first proletariat international. This was centuries before the writings of Karl Marx. A medieval spiritual communist society. Obviously, I read on to learn more about the heretics and what they did and what they stood for, but this was mind-blowing stuff. I'm not here, by the way, to relay this entire book to you. There is so much that will be left unsaid, and I'm trying to give you snippets, little moments where my eyes were opened to pieces of history that I did not understand, pieces of philosophy and theology, and as I said, social politics. This is a truly eye-opening, life-changing book, and that was where it started for me, with learning about the heretics. My next point just says, "The patriarchal church is afraid of women," page 36. This is from the beginning of a subchapter called The Politicization of Sexuality. As Mary Condren has pointed out in The Serpent and the Goddess, 1989, which is a study of the penetration of Christianity into Celtic Ireland, the church's attempt to regulate sexual behaviour had a long history in Europe. From a very early period, after Christianity became a state religion in the 4th century, the clergy recognised the power that sexual desire gave women over men, and persistently tried to exorcise it by identifying holiness with avoidance of women and sex, expelling women from any moment of the liturgy and from the administration of the sacraments, trying to usurp women's life-giving magical powers by adopting a feminine dress, and by making sexuality an object of shame. All these were the means by which a patriarchal caste tried to break the power of women and erotic attraction. Now I have to say, this book is actually kind of light on the religion, focusing instead on patriarchy and capitalism and how those two things used the church, used religion, used doctrine to twist the minds of people and hold power over them. But this is a moment where you can see how the church was afraid of women in the Middle Ages. And this is kind of how patriarchy as we know it today began. My next point says, "Capitalism instills division into the working class as a distraction," page 63. This is from the introductory part of chapter 2, and it kind of summarizes a point that's made later on. "We cannot therefore identify capitalist accumulation with the liberation of the worker, female or male, as many Marxists among others have done, or see the advent of capitalism as a moment of historical progress. On the contrary, capitalism has created more brutal and insidious forms of enslavement, as it has planted into the body of the proletariat deep divisions that have served to intensify and conceal exploitation. It is in great part because of these imposed divisions, especially those between women and men, that capitalist accumulation continues to devastate life in every corner of the planet." That is impassioned stuff, and as you go on, you find out exactly what she's talking about here. This next point is a fascinating, eye-opening explanation as to how capitalism began in Western Europe. And I just wrote, "Capitalism began with something called Enclosure." In the 16th century, enclosure was a technical term indicating a set of strategies the English lords and rich farmers used to eliminate communal land property and expand their holdings. It mostly referred to the abolition of the open field system, an arrangement by which villagers owned non-contiguous strips of land in a non-hedged field. Enclosing also included the fencing off of commons and the pulling down of the shacks of poor cottagers who had no land but could survive because they had access to customary rights. Large tracts of land were also enclosed to create deer parks, while entire villages were cast down to be laid to pasture. Though the enclosures were continued into the 18th century, even before the Reformation, more than 2,000 rural communities were destroyed in this way. So severe was the extinction of rural villages that in 1518 and again in 1548, the Crown called for an investigation. But despite the appointment of several royal commissions, little was done to stop the trend. What began instead was an intense struggle, climaxing in numerous uprisings, accompanied by a long debate on the merits and demands of land privatization, which is still continuing today. This was the moment with this thing called enclosure, when capitalists became more powerful than even the crown. This is a very small and funny one that just says, that quote about wages on page 74. Because in the medieval period, wages meant something different and served a different function. Capitalism took the concept of wages and turned it into something else. Not surprisingly, with land expropriation came a change in the workers' attitudes towards the wage. While in the Middle Ages, wages could be viewed as an instrument of freedom, in contrast to the compulsion of the labour service, as soon as access to land came to an end, wages began to be viewed as an instrument of enslavement. This next point says, women were medical experts in the Middle Ages, page 28, but replaced by men in the 16th century, page 98. This quote is actually preceded by a bit that mentions how there were many guilds for workers, and those guilds included women, either in equal number to men or even a higher number than men. By the 14th century, women were also becoming school teachers as well as doctors and surgeons, and were beginning to compete with university-trained men, gaining at times a high reputation. 16 female doctors, among them several Jewish women specialized in surgery or eye therapy, were hired in the 14th century by the municipality of Frankfurt, which, like other city administrations, offered its population a system of public healthcare. Female doctors, as well as midwives or sage femmes, were dominant in obstetrics, either in pay of city government or supporting themselves with the compensation they received from their patients. After the caesarean cut was introduced in the 13th century, female obstetrics were the only ones who practiced it. Fast forward about 300 years, the rise of capitalism, and we get this. With the marginalization of the midwife, the process began by which women lost the control they had exercised over procreation and were reduced to a passive role in child delivery, while male doctors came to be seen as the true givers of life. With this shift, a new medical practice also prevailed, one that, in the case of a medical emergency, prioritized the life of the fetus over that of the mother. So begins the concept of pro-life. While in the Middle Ages, women had access to many forms of natural contraception, women's control over their own bodies was made illegal under the rise of capitalism. Page 102. Honestly, pages like 95 to 110 are my most annotated parts. This was an electric moment of the book. This is from the start of a subchapter called The Devaluation of Women's Labour. The criminalization of women's control over procreation is a phenomenon whose importance cannot be overemphasized, both from the viewpoint of its effects on women and its consequences for capitalist organization of work. As is well documented, through the Middle Ages, women had possessed many means of contraception, mostly consisting of herbs, which turned into potions and pessaries, suppositories, were used to quicken a woman's period, provoke an abortion, or create a condition of sterility. I did not know any of that. That is important and fascinating. 16th century misogyny is the reason sex work is vilified today, pages 105 and 113. No sooner had prostitution become the main form of subsistence for a large female population than the institutional attitude towards it changed. Some women had some jobs and men said, no, you can't have that. Whereas in the late Middle Ages, it had been officially accepted as a necessary evil, and prostitutes had benefited from the high wage regime. In the 16th century, the situation was reversed. In a climate of intense misogyny, characterized by the advance of the Protestant Reformation and witch hunting, prostitution was first subjugated to new restrictions and then criminalized. Everywhere, between 1530 and 1560, town brothels were closed, and prostitutes, especially streetwalkers, were subjected to severe penalties, banishment, flogging, and other cruel forms of chastisement. On to 113. The criminalization of prostitution, which punished the women but hardly touched her male customers, strengthened male power. Any man could now destroy a woman by simply declaring that she was a prostitute, or by publicizing that she had given in to his sexual desires. Women would have to plead with men not to take away their honor, the only property left to them. The assumption being that their lives were now in the hands of men who, like feudal lords, could exercise over them a power of life and death. This next one pissed me off so much. It was shocking, fascinating, and very aggravating. The reason housework isn't deemed work is because it's unpaid. 106. But in the Middle Ages, it was considered equal to other forms of labour. Page 19. Back to chapter 1, she had this to say. Since work on the servile farm was organised on a subsistence basis, the sexual division of labour in it was less pronounced and less discriminating than in a capitalist farm. In the feudal village, no social separation existed between the production of goods and the reproduction of the workforce. All work contributed to the family's sustenance. Women worked in the fields in addition to raising children, cooking, washing, spinning, and keeping an herb garden. Their domestic activities were not devalued and did not involve different social relations from those of men as they would later in a money economy, when housework would cease to be viewed as real work. Back to page 106. Though women's waged work, housework, and paid sexual work are still studied all too often in isolation from each other, we are now in a better position to see that the discrimination that women have suffered in the waged workforce has been directly rooted in their function as unpaid labourers in the home. We can thus connect the banning of prostitution and the expulsion of women from the organised workplace with the creation of the housewife and the reconstruction of the family as a locus for the production of labour power. However, from a theoretical and political viewpoint, the fundamental question is under what conditions such degradation was possible and what social forces promoted it or were complicitous in it. This next bit I just wrote that whole section on page 108. The section in question is called Women, the New Commons and the Substitution for the Lost Land. It was from this alliance between the crafts and the urban authorities, along with the continuing privatization of land, that a new sexual division of labour, or better, a new sexual contract, in Carol Pateman's words, was forged, defining women in terms, mothers, wives, daughters, widows, that hid their status as workers, while giving men free access to women's bodies, their labour, and the bodies and labour of their children. According to this new social sexual contract, proletarian women became for male workers the substitute for the land lost to the enclosures, their most basic means of reproduction, and a communal good anyone could appropriate and use at will. Echoes of this primitive appropriation can be heard in the concept of the common woman, which in the 16th century qualified those who prostituted themselves. But in the new organisation of work, every woman, other than those privatised by bourgeois men, became a communal good. For once, women's activities were defined as non-work. Women's labour began to appear as a natural resource, available to all, no less than the air we breathe or the water we drink. This is the moment at which we see how capitalism and patriarchy together dehumanize women and effectively turn women into non-paid, labour-creating labour machines. This next bit just says, capitalism is slavery. Page 119. It is now established that the plantation system fueled the Industrial Revolution, as argued by Eric Williams, who noted that hardly a brick in Liverpool and Bristol was not cemented with African blood. But capitalism may not even have taken off without Europe's annexation of America and the blood and sweat that for 2 centuries flowed to Europe from the plantations. This must be stressed, as it helps us realize how essential slavery has been for the history of capitalism, and why periodically but systemically, whenever the capitalist system is threatened by a major economic crisis, the capitalist class has to launch a process of primitive accumulation. That is, a process of large-scale colonization and enslavement. Next, I wrote, altering public opinion of our own bodies using philosophy and the church as tools to meet that end turns people into machines who feel alienated from their own bodies. 140 to 142. Okay, there is obviously a lot here because this is 3 pages, so I'm going to cherry pick bits. But it really is so fascinating. To begin this part, Silvia Federici references the medieval skirmishes between angels and devils for the possession of the departing soul, and then goes on to say, but the conflict is now staged within the person who is reconstructed as a battlefield, where opposite elements clash for domination. On the one side, there are the forces of reason, parsimony, prudence, sense of responsibility, self-control. On the other, the low instincts of the body, lewdness, idleness, systematic dissipation of one's vital energies. The battle is fought on many fronts because reason must be vigilant against the attacks of the carnal self and prevent the wisdom of the flesh, in Luther's words, from corrupting the powers of the mind. This whole section is about capitalists using the church, using dogma, using scripture as propaganda to refocus the general public's thinking and attitude towards the brain and the body. And this lasts to this day. The most obvious example is laziness, grind culture. You have to work, you have to put in the effort. You're not working hard enough, you're being lazy. Every boomer I've ever known is like this. You've got to work hard, you've got to grind, you're not working hard enough, you're not feeding the capitalist system. It all started here, with capitalists co-opting Christian scripture to create propaganda about being a better worker and being ashamed of your body, ashamed of being tired or enjoying food or sex or anything else. It's fucked. Kat wanted to say hi. She was a big fan of this book, and not just because her name is Mary Wollstonecraft, no. Well, maybe mostly that. You're hungry, aren't you? Okay, I'll wrap this up and then I'll feed you. Now, this book is called Caliban and the Witch. Shakespeare's character Caliban from The Tempest, which is referenced all the way through the book, is kind of a metaphor for the general labour force, the working class, and the objectified and utilised bodies of minority ethnic people. But the witch side of it begins in the penultimate and largest chapter, which is all about the witch hunts, and the next final few points are all about that. First, a short point. Capitalism played a role in the witch hunts, which is what I thought at the beginning. Page 152. Now, just before this point, Silvia Federici talks about how the traditional herbalistic medicinal practices of women used in the Middle Ages were all abolished and vilified. Eradicating these practices was a necessary condition for the capitalist rationalization of work, since magic appeared as an illicit form of power and an instrument to obtain what one wanted without work. That is, a refusal of work in action. Magic kills industry, lamented Francis Bacon, admitting that nothing repelled him so much as the assumption that one could obtain results with a few idle expedients rather than with the sweat of one's brow. This again is about mind altering. The idea that you have to subjugate your own body to the production of someone else's wealth in order to be worth anything, in order to feel fulfilled, and obviously it gets way worse. Because I then went on to note down, in fact, witch hunts solidified modern capitalism. This is from a subchapter on page 176 titled Witch Burning Times and the State Initiative. What has not been recognised is that the witch hunt was one of the most important events in the development of capitalist society and the formation of the modern proletariat. For the unleashing of a campaign of terror against women unmatched by any other persecution, weakened the resistance of the European peasantry to the assault launched against it by the gentry and the state at a time when the peasant community was already disintegrating under the combined impact of land privatization, increased taxation, and the extension of state control over every aspect of social life. The witch hunt deepened the divisions between women and men, teaching men to fear the power of women, and destroyed a universe of practices, beliefs, and social subjects whose existence was incompatible with the capitalist work discipline, thus redefining the main elements of social reproduction. In this sense, like the contemporary attack on popular culture and the great confinement of paupers and vagabonds in workhouses and correction houses, the witch hunt was an essential aspect of primitive accumulation and the transition to capitalism. Double, in fact, capitalism caused the witch hunts, page 185. It is significant that in England, most of the witch trials occurred in Essex, where by the 16th century the bulk of the land had been enclosed, while in those regions of the British Isles where land privatisation had neither occurred nor was on the agenda, we have no record of witch hunting. The most outstanding examples in this context are Ireland and the Scottish Western Highlands, where no trace can be found of the persecution, likely because a collective land tenure system and kinship ties still prevailed in both areas that precluded the communal division and the type of complicity with the state that made a witch hunt impossible. Thus, while in the anglicised and privatised Scottish lowlands, where the subsistence economy was vanishing under the impact of the Presbyterian Reformation, the witch hunt claimed at least 4,000 victims, the equivalent of 1% of the female population. In the Highlands and in Ireland, women were safe during the witch-burning times. That is, as I've said many times at this point, mind-blowing. Triple, in fact. Witch hunts were a suppression of potential class revolt. 188 and 189. This is my last point. This is where a subchapter begins titled Witch Hunting and Class Revolt. The witch hunt grew in a social environment where the better sorts were living in a constant fear of the lower classes, who could certainly be expected to harbour evil thoughts, because in this period they were losing everything they had. That this fear expressed itself as an attack on popular magic is not surprising. The battle against magic has always accompanied the development of capitalism. To this very day, magic is premised on the belief that the world is animated, unpredictable, and that there is a force in all things. Water, trees, substances, words, so that every event is interpreted as the expression of an occult power that must be deciphered and bent to one's will. Magic was also an obstacle to the rationalization of the work process and a threat to the establishment of the principle of individual responsibility. Above all, magic seemed a form of refusal to work, of insubordination, and an instrument of grassroots resistance to power. The world had to be disenchanted in order to be dominated. Though the witch hunt targeted a broad variety of female practices, it was above all in this capacity, as sorcerers, healers, performers of incantations and divinations, that women were persecuted. For their claim to magical power undermined the power of the authorities and the state, giving confidence to the poor in their ability to manipulate the natural and social environment and possibly subvert the constituted order. I could of course go on, but this might be the longest video I've ever made. There is so much about this book that opens your eyes to the rise of and the relationship between capitalism and patriarchy. They are in effect one and the same, and all of that is explored in this mind-blowing, eye-opening book that has absolutely changed my life. You have to read Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. I think I might have made that clear by now. At least I hope I have. Please read this book, of which I've quoted about half by this point, and subscribe for books.